Hi, Luis Lopez here from the Common Catholic. I'm here with my sister Joanna.
Hey.
Hello. We're doing our first Saturday podcast, and the topic today is the redemption of Lieutenant Dan. Me and my sister quote movies nonstop, and we love movies. And Forrest Gump is a movie that, I mean, it's one of the greatest movies ever made, and there's so much hidden in the movie that I think most people don't realize or they don't catch. It came out in the mid '90s, so it's probably out of fashion by now. But we're actually there's so much that we can go over in the movie, but this morning we're choosing to focus on the character of Lieutenant Dan, and I think he has a lot to relate to many of us because he kind of goes through what we go through. I mean, in a sense, he goes kind of in the extreme, but I think if we really look at his character and who he was, who he becomes, that we can relate to him, especially on a Christian point of view. So I guess the first place to start is, who is Lieutenant Dan?
When we first see Lieutenant Dan, he is, in Vietnam, and he's this like hard and like harsh and like, soldier that just gets things done, and he's kind of intimidating, and like, Forrest and Bubba meet him, and off the bat they're just like, wow, this is the guy, like this is the boss. So when we see him, he's just like just your quintessential, soldier that is hard and is ready for anything, and is ready to fight in battle and to lead his troops to where they're going to be at. So when we first see him, we just think like, wow, this is the guy, like this is the important guy. And it's funny because like whenever he comes out or we first see him, he's like in a tent and he comes out, right? He just like steps out.
Yeah, he steps out.
So he like definitely makes an appearance, and I think like just the first time you see him, he makes that impression that he's the soldier, and something that Forrest is, not that he's intimidated by him, but he's just like, wow, I don't want to let him down, like he's
I sure hope I don't let him down.
Yeah, I sure hope I don't let him down. Okay. So, that's what, we see when we first see Lieutenant Dan.
He's almost like a stereotype of the American, though, like quintessential hard guy.
Like Uncle Sam.
Uncle
best.
Sam,
like
American.
Uncle Sam's finest, like
Yeah.
American.
We want you.
Yeah, we want you kind of thing. Like he embodies that for what we think of a soldier.
Say. Well, so we meet Lieutenant Dan, and immediately we see that he kind of he leads his men really well, and he has like this weird thing where he stops his soldiers every now and then.
And then the sock thing.
He has like this intuition.
Yeah.
It's almost like comedic relief as well because it's so weird.
Because he's so out there, like he's kind of like, it is kind of comical, like the stuff that he says. It's funny because it's not that he's a parody of a soldier in any way, but it's just like he says a lot of things that you would think a soldier at that time would say.
Yeah. A soldier at that time. Well, I think what's most unique, I guess something to his character that really stands out, and they show it in the film, but that he's like a descendant of in every American war he had a relative who died.
That happened to look like him.
That just happened to look like. That just happened to look exactly like him.
That we see him die. It's like literally him dying.
Yeah, so it's almost like we see him dying
many times,
and we get this sense or foreshadowing that he's supposed to die in this war. Like that's his destiny or his purpose, and I guess that comes to a head in battle. In war, when there's an attack, and Forrest, the squad is like broken up, and he loses Bubba, he loses his friends, and then
he trips over Lieutenant Dan.
At some point he trips over Lieutenant Dan, and Lieutenant Dan is calling for an airstrike, and Forrest, because he doesn't know any better, but maybe he does know better because maybe his natural intuition is to get everyone out, like to save life, and Lieutenant Dan wants to be left on the field.
Yeah, he says, "Leave me. What are you doing, Forrest? Like, leave me here. Like, leave me here. That's an order." And he still doesn't listen to his orders. You know, obviously to his superior, he goes against his own orders, and he picks him up and takes him. And he's upset because he's like, "Just leave me here. Like, I'm gonna die. This is where I'm gonna die. This is where I'm supposed to die." And, Forrest doesn't even really consider leaving him there. He picks him up and takes him out of the jungle and, throws him on the beach. And because of Forrest, essentially he saves his life because, it was about to get bombed and he most certainly would have died, not as a result from his injuries, but from the bombs.
Yeah.
So in a way, it was kind of like he wasn't killed outright in the film. It was like he was ensuring his own death with the bombs. So he knew, like, hey, I'm in charge of my death. Like, yeah, I'm injured.
Control.
I don't have any legs, but I'm still going to control the situation because I'm still going to have the bombs dropped. And I know for sure I am not going to survive this. I'm going to die out here in the battlefield where I'm supposed to die. And Forrest came along and, like, took that away from him.
So, and it's almost like maybe he didn't even give himself this fate. I mean, he realizes that in his mind, he thinks because all those before me did this thing, I have to do it too.
Yeah, like he had something to live up to. Not so much live up to, because he's obviously not going to live, but he felt like maybe like it was even an expectation in his family. Maybe like his family honored the heroes that died on battlefield. Maybe it was also a family thing, although they don't really get into that in the movie. It was just maybe even his family expected that from him as well, that he was going to die. And that's what he wanted to give his family, possibly.
But I guess that speaks to many people who grow up in an environment who are used to
doing what's expected of you.
Yeah, X, Y, and Z, and just following the trend or the status quo. And even it may be a good thing, but it also may be a bad thing. Like if you grow up in a home where your father is absent, for many times, or you grow up in a home that's a broken home or that has drugs and alcohol in it. Maybe you think that, okay, well, this is my destiny, this is my fate, that I'm supposed to be like those before me.
Like I'm gonna be like my father. Like no matter what I do, it's just my destiny. I'm going to be like my father no matter what I do. And I think that's what he thought. Like, no matter what I do, I'm going to be a soldier and I'm going to die on the battlefield. That's what I'm going to do no matter what I do. That's how my end's going to... That's how I'm going to end... Not end his life, but just... That's how my life is going to finish,
Yeah, so Forrest ends up saving his life, and then the next time that we see Lieutenant Dan... He's bedridden and he's miserable, and there's a scene where Forrest gives him ice cream, and he throws it in a bedpan like he doesn't want anything, like he doesn't want any comfort, or he wants to just sulk and be miserable because he didn't die, or he didn't. This idea that he had for himself that he thought was planned out, this fate of dying. It comes to a point where now he's miserable, and we see this scene at night where they're both sleeping next to each other, and somehow with no legs he gets off his bed and pulls Forrest on the floor, and there's this really intense moment where we see like the anger and everything coming out at Forrest. He says, I was supposed to die on the field. That was my destiny, and you stole it from me.
And then he lets Forrest go, and he like is kind of like staring off in his face, and
he's like just crying,
and he's like upset, and he's like, I was Lieutenant Dan Taylor, and he goes, I was, like he's looking off, like remembering like what he was, like kind of like he was already dead. And then Forrest comes in and says, you're still Lieutenant Dan Taylor.
Yeah.
Like, you're still you. Like, you're still you. I mean, even though he changed, it was like, you're still alive. Like, you're still you. And I think at that moment, he kind of felt like his old self was kind of like dead. Like, he had no he didn't know where he was going to go from that moment because he never saw further than him dying in Battlefield.
So his purpose was tied to that identity, was tied to that being a warrior, being a soldier in battle.
Ultimately sacrificing himself for like the greater good or for his country, which in his sense, in his thinking, was the most honorable death that his life could have accumulated to, was an honorable death.
So that in itself, is not really a bad thing to want to serve your country, and even if necessary to sacrifice yourself for your country, love of country. But even that the idea of giving one's life for your country, that there's no greater good above that.
It was like noble. Like it was a noble thing.
And it goes back to antiquity, though. even the Spartans or some of the Greeks thought that there's nothing in my life greater than I can do than
dying in battle,
than dying for my country. But I guess in a Christian sense, we do believe that there's no greater thing that we can do than to give our life for our friends, than to sacrifice, to lay one's life down for our friends. So that in itself is a good thing, but I think with Lieutenant Dan, it's something different. It's more of, this is what I'm supposed to do. This destiny that I've been raised in, I'm doing it because I don't know what else.
Like I don't have anything else, I don't want to say going for me, but I don't see further in my life.
This is my purpose, and that's it.
Than this death right here.
And if this doesn't happen, then I don't have a purpose.
Yes.
So, for I guess a few years in Forrest's life, we don't see Lieutenant Dan, and then Forrest becomes like a champion ping pong player.
And wins the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yeah. and we see Forrest on a TV show, and he comes out of the studio, and we hear this voice, "They gave you the Congressional Medal of Honor."
And Forrest is like, when he turns around,
he's happy.
Like, genuinely happy. Like, Lieutenant Dan, like, he was so
he missed
happy
him.
To see him, to be able to see him again. And, he was an old friend. So it was kind of like Forrest couldn't even contain his joy from seeing Lieutenant Dan for the first time after a lot of years. And, we see Lieutenant Dan, and he's very, like, disheveled. He's wearing, like, these kind of, like, weird clothes.
He's washed up.
And he's, like, washed up and, just looks
miserable.
Really,
terrible.
Really terrible. It just looks really, really bad. He looks like he has, like, bags under his eyes. And you can just tell from his demeanor in the film that he's not a happy person at all. You know that right off the bat.
His hair's all long.
Yeah, like, you know that, right?
He doesn't really care how he looks.
Yeah. So,
But do you think he's happy maybe just a little bit to see Forrest? Obviously he finds out, to be there at the studio where he just was on TV means that he saw him on TV, maybe, and that he raced over to the studio to meet him.
Yeah. Maybe to, like, I don't know, confront him a little bit, or maybe just to be like, he was in disbelief that, Forrest won this award for saving his life, but he felt like he should have never saved my life, so he should have never won the Congressional Medal of Honor, because I should be dead,
Yeah.
Like, I think it's also, too, just, like, disbelief, like, wow, I cannot believe they gave that to you, because, not so much that you don't deserve it, it's just, you should have never got it, because I should be dead.
I wonder if I don't know if Lieutenant Dan needs someone to take care of him, because he seems to get around quite well. But I wonder if he seeks him out to kind of have company, or maybe he knows that Forrest will take care of him.
So then we see, I think it's a really powerful scene whenever they're in the bar for New Year's Eve, and there's like a shot of Lieutenant Dan. There's like this party going on all around him, and the camera like focuses on him, and there's somebody puts like a hat on his head, and the camera like shows his face. So you see, like, all this, I guess, like, happiness around him, but they show his face, and he just looks, like, miserable, like, completely unhappy, like, people get excited for a new year because it's a new year, and that girl, one of the girls that was there, says everybody gets a second chance. You know, everybody gets a second chance. It's a new year, you can start all over again. But it's like he's thinking to himself, like, I can't start all over again. Like, I'm done. Like, I have nothing to look forward to. I can't start fresh.
I'm just here.
I'm just here. I'm just existing. Like, it was like he was so depressed knowing that he was going to have to live another year in his life. So I think it was very obvious that he didn't know.
He's not happy.
Yeah, he's not happy, but he's kind of like existing without a purpose or without happiness. He's kind of like mentally already dead in a sense.
Yeah, and you know that is a powerful scene too, because you think if you're gonna be happy, it's gonna be on New Year's when you don't have to worry about anything. You can celebrate starting over.
Yeah, because you're forgetting your past.
Yeah,
you got a fresh opportunity to start over. Everybody gets excited, and like I said, she said that statement of, you know, you can just start all over, and he just felt like, why, how can I start all over?
It's almost like, like you said, that there's a party going around, but he's choosing not to be involved, or he's choosing to sit in the corner by himself.
Yeah, because
and be separate.
Yeah, because everybody's happy for a new fresh start. We all like fresh starts, but he feels like, why, I shouldn't even have a fresh start. What's the purpose? What's the point?
Yeah. So then we go to this scene where it's like an after party at Lieutenant Dan's apartment, and there's the two women there, and you know, obviously Forrest doesn't, you know, he's very
innocent.
He's very innocent, and he doesn't really want to have a part of it, and Lieutenant Dan is kind of into it, you know, because you know he likes probably, you know, he likes alcohol, and I'm sure he likes women and pleasure, and but this scene actually reveals a deeper relationship between Lieutenant Dan and Forrest.
That he actually cares about.
That he actually cares for him, because the woman with Forrest is complaining that he's not, you know, responding to her gestures and advances, and the woman says, you know, what's wrong with your friend? Is he stupid or something? And we see Lieutenant Dan change. Like, we see him get real serious, and, you know, we see him tell her, you know, don't call him stupid. Don't you ever call him stupid. And I think Forrest is kind of taken back what is happening.
Because he's defending him.
He's defending him, and we probably see that they have more in common than we realize, because Forrest, on one hand, is very innocent and very, I mean, he is go with the flow. He's, you know, he doesn't really have malice, or, you know, he's not aware of a lot of things that people usually are aware of. And Lieutenant Dan is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Like, he's very bitter and self-aware, and, you know, he'll probably tell you what he thinks, and he doesn't care because he's lost everything. What has he got to lose? And he's very, very hard and bitter. And you would think that, well, these people aren't even going to hang around each other, or they won't be good company. But we see that that Lieutenant Dan defends Forrest Gump, and it's probably because they are related. So Lieutenant Dan, having lost his legs, feeling handicapped, does feel some sort of connection, and even wants to defend Forrest because he realizes that he's handicapped also.
Which is something that he never expected to be, like, in his life. Like, to be, like, lumped up with Forrest. Like, that probably never dawned on him that, like, okay, because I even think Forrest says, you know, Lieutenant Dan doesn't want to be called crippled, just like I don't want to be called stupid.
Yeah.
You know, like, I think Forrest even says that, because it's kind of, you know, belittling. Like, we don't want people to belittle us in life, and, you know, Forrest is a really good person, but people are always going to see his disability before anything.
Yeah.
And I think with Lieutenant Dan, it's like, it's very obvious. Like, with Forrest, it's a mental thing, so you don't really know until you get to know him. But, like, with Lieutenant Dan, you look at him and you know that he doesn't have
that he's missing something.
You know, and he can't hide that. So it just never dawned on him that, you know, he would be in that same, you know, category with Forrest, but he is.
So in the beginning, we see Lieutenant Dan. He's like this strong warrior and soldier and leads people in the battle. And then at this point, we see him very physically handicapped. And so it's almost like he represents a physical handicap.
Like a literal physical
Yeah.
transformation.
And then Forrest represents a mental handicap. So it's almost like they're different, but in a sense they're connecting.
They have like a connection. Yeah.
But one thing that I guess really probably affects Lieutenant Dan is if we go back to that scene at the bar, Forrest tells Lieutenant Dan, "I'm going to be a shrimp boat captain." And he's like, "Well, why?" And he's like, "I made a promise to Bubba that I would be, so I'm going to." So one thing we realize about Forrest is that he keeps his word. Mm-hmm. Even if, Bubba, who dies in the movie, who's no longer there, there's no reason why he would have to keep his promise.
His promise to him.
But he chooses to do so, and he tells this to Lieutenant Dan, and Lieutenant Dan kind of makes fun of him.
Like, he's kind of, like, incredulous, like, "Oh, wow, you're gonna be a shrimp boat captain?" Like, like, no way. Like,
yeah. And
he
then,
doesn't believe it.
Maybe joking, he says, "If you're ever a shrimp boat captain, I'll come and be your first mate."
And I don't think he ever thought
that would happen.
that would happen, but lo and behold, Forrest did keep his word.
Yeah, so, we're not going to go there yet, but at that point, the roles have switched, because now Forrest is like the captain, and Lieutenant Dan is following him.
Yeah, it's like he became, the leader. Forrest did become the leader, and he became like the soldier, which they definitely had a role reversal there.
Yeah. So there is a moment, I don't know if it's after the scene with the women or before, but Lieutenant Dan asks him this question about, or he's going to counseling.
Oh, I think it's before.
It's before, and he's he's talking about Jesus. And at the counselor, he said, they're asking him, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And that you'll walk again beside him in the kingdom of heaven. And he's
really angry, and he throws a bottle or something.
It's almost like there's no way, like he doesn't believe.
But I think at the time too, at that moment, we see like his anger towards God. I think maybe it's never said out loud, but he feels like this is a punishment. Like, I'm living my punishment, and I'm not the person that I used to be.
It's almost like he's in hell.
Yeah, it's almost like he's in his own personal hell. And also too, it's just like it's a constant battle between good and evil, because when you look at him, you don't think, "Oh, how could Lieutenant Dan be good?" He's just miserable. He messes with the women. He's drinking. He says a lot of horrible things to people, and he just is crabby and just so, not the vision of somebody who you would think is right.
A good moral character.
Yeah, like good moral character, or somebody that's right with God. So it's very evident that we know that he has placed God on the back burner because of the anger and the resentment and the punishment of, like, God is punishing me. And I felt like that's how he felt in the movie. I'm being punished. Not so much like, "Oh, this is all God's fault," but not that I wanted to be with God, but it's like, why has God left me here to suffer this way?
So I wonder if it seems like he believes in God, but that God is punishing him. And maybe he thinks that he's punishing him because he didn't get to live out his fate.
Yeah.
That he now, since he didn't die on the field of battle, he has no legs, he's suffering.
Because I think, too, he does believe that God is, your maker, because he's like, "I didn't get to meet my maker." So maybe he's like, God didn't want me to come home to him, and he left me here. You know what I mean? Like, he could have taken me, but he didn't. Why didn't you take me when I wanted to go? And I think that made him really, really angry at God.
Yeah. So I guess in that point of the movie, Forrest moves on. Eventually becomes like a ping pong champion. He gets money from endorsements. And eventually he does live out his promise to become a shrimp boat captain. And he has his boat. And then there is a scene where he's on his boat, and he sees Lieutenant Dan on the pier in a wheelchair. And he's happy to see him.
He's happy to see him, but also too, like, what's kind of foreshadowing, if you think about it, Lieutenant Dan doesn't have peace, but as he's passing by, and of course at the time it's like the hippie movement, people were always doing the peace sign, but if you notice, he does the peace sign to Forrest.
Oh, he does.
So it's kind of like he doesn't have peace, but it's kind of
it's like he's here to get it.
He's here to get it, or he's coming in peace, or he's coming to seek peace. So it's like, I didn't even realize, like, that's what he does. It's like he's looking for his peace, and he tells Forrest, like, peace. You know what I mean?
Does he tell him peace?
No, he just, like,
Oh.
as he's like going by and he passes
gives him a
by
peace
him,
sign.
he gives him a peace sign. So it's kind of foreshadowing of maybe what he's expecting to get, or maybe even he doesn't realize, like, that's what he's going to get because he's back with Forrest.
And so, yeah, so there is the fact that Lieutenant Dan is even there means that what Forrest said in that bar, like, affected him, because maybe, you know, it's comforting to Lieutenant Dan to see Forrest choose something and kind of live out to it. Maybe because he feels his life is in chaos.
Like he's looking for structure, maybe.
Maybe he's looking for some kind of structure, but the fact that he's even there, that he honors his promise, and that he made jokingly, you know, if you're ever a shrimp boat captain, I'll be your first mate. So the fact that he's even there says a lot about Lieutenant Dan, and probably, you know, we don't really know what's happened in between the time that we see him at this scene.
But I think too, like, I think at that moment or at that point in his life, I think that he's kind of like done with God. Like he's at his last, like, I don't want to say bastion. That's not the correct word, but it's kind of like he's at his like last. Like he is completely done with God. He doesn't believe in God anymore. Because there's a remark that he makes to Forrest whenever, you know, they're on the shrimp boat and they're not catching anything. I think that's what he says. And he says to Forrest, "Where's this God of yours?"
Maybe you should just pray for shrimp.
Yeah, maybe you should just. So he's always making like these like
he's bitter
snide remarks about God, because I think at that point in his life, he's completely done with God and believing in Him, and he's just. I mean, it's never defined that he's an atheist, but it's just very obvious that he doesn't believe in God anymore. Like, that's very obvious.
Or if he does, he doesn't care. Or he thinks that God is not good.
Like, he thinks, you know, God...
That God is punishing him.
Yeah, he just has all the anger and the rage, like, that's there.
So, in the movie, we do see that Forrest does start going to church.
Oh, yeah, he prays for shrimp.
Yeah, he starts singing in the choir. And the funny thing is that Lieutenant Dan, you know, shows up sometimes.
Even and he's sitting there in the back with, like, he's drinking.
Yeah, he's drinking in church. But I do think it's almost like a subtle change. It's almost like he wants to change, and
he doesn't know how to get it.
He doesn't know how to get it. You know, maybe that's most of us, and we want to change, and we don't know where to start, so we go through the motions. But Lieutenant Dan is an extreme example, I would say. But I do think he's starting to change very slowly. And as you said earlier, it's like after he loses his legs and feels that his fate or his destiny was robbed from him, he starts into this storm.
Yeah, like if you think about it, he had been living, because, you know, his purpose was taken away from him to die in battle. That was his war. That was the war of his life. And after that happens, he's kind of living in a storm. And I think that's kind of symbolic to people who don't have God, or who are losing God, and who look to other things to kind of fill the void. It's like you're kind of like in a storm between good and evil, because it's like you want to believe, but then you're angry or you're mad, or you're like, why am I suffering so much? Like, I'm questioning things. So it's like, it's a very stormy atmosphere when you're on the cusp of losing your faith. And I think that he was losing his faith in a lot. So he was kind of living in like a storm, his own storm. So I think what's kind of brilliant about the movie is literally a storm does come. Yeah. And, you know, it shows
it's like the climax of his whole life since then.
It's like the climax, it's like the ultimate storm, like the storm that he had been living. It was like the final battle, and it was literally his battle, if you think about it. So, you know, Forrest is like on a boat, and he's trying to steer it, The meantime, like, Lieutenant Dan's up on the very top.
And he says he was mad.
He was mad, and he was, like, crazy. And you see him, like, screaming, and he says, it's time for a showdown. It's between you and me, and I'm right here. And if you think about it, it's like he was the ultimate soldier, and he was still a soldier, and that was his war.
It's like he was still at war.
Yeah, that was his literal, like, final battle of, like, himself and his life. And it was not that he was putting God to a test, but that was all he knew was to fight. And he was fighting.
To fight an enemy.
Yeah, like to fight an enemy. So, because he considered God his enemy. Because he was like, it's time for a showdown. It's me and you. I'm right here. Blah, blah, blah. So then, after that, we go to the storm's over, and they're the only ones that still survived. All the shrimping industry is done, and, they were out in the bay or wherever they were, and their boat was still working, and they survived, and with probably minimal damage.
I wonder if he thought that he was going to die in the storm, or he wanted to die in the storm. Or maybe he just didn't care.
I just think that I don't think he expected to die. I think that he thought that he was so strong. I'm stronger than God. I'm stronger than the storm. I'm still here.
Okay.
Like, I'm stronger. Like, hey, I'm right here. Like, come take me. Or if you're not going to take me, like, I'm right here. So it was like the strength was still there. And I think if you think about it, he says, I was Lieutenant Dan Taylor, like where he's having that conversation with Forrest. And then he's like, you're still Lieutenant Dan Taylor. And at that moment, it's like, we see he still is that hard soldier, and that soldier in his heart that he always was. He was still Lieutenant Dan,
Yeah,
he
still
was that strong as a soldier.
And Forrest even, that's all he calls him is Lieutenant Dan.
Yeah, he still calls him Lieutenant Dan.
That's all he knows. And even at the end of the movie, you see he says Lieutenant Dan.
And I think too, Lieutenant Dan thought he was a certain way, like, I'm hard and I command people and I'm not afraid. And it's like, in that moment, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of, I guess, the storm. He wasn't afraid of God anymore. He was just like, this is who I am. This is who I always was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so they go through the storm. They're the only boat left, and they start to do well. And just a side note, I can't help but think of, the calming at the storm of sea with Jesus, and how, the boat, the disciples, it's being shook with waves, and then Jesus essentially calms the storm. And I think that, as disciples, we do go through storms. I mean, even maybe, Forrest's whole life is a storm in a sense, because he's always having to survive.
Different situations.
He's always having to defend and adapt when he feels out of place. So maybe that's, it certainly does relate to all of us. But after that, sometime we come to a scene where
it's like peaceful, calm.
It's peaceful. The water, again, the water is calm. The storm has been calmed. There's a beautiful horizon, and it's Forrest and Lieutenant Dan, and he says, "I never thanked you for saving my life." And then he just jumps off the boat, and he kind of just swims, and it's like he's letting go, and there is a sense of like he gets in the water, and
like he's baptized.
The water, like he's been baptized through the storm. Now he's in the water, and he's not really moving fast or angry. He's just peacefully swimming through the water, and
you see, like, in the background, like, it's the sun,
the sun,
it's the light, because if you think about, Jesus is the light or God is the light, so he's swimming kind of like towards the light.
Yeah.
So it's a very beautiful scene, because it's like he found peace.
Found peace.
God, but he also found peace within himself.
Yeah.
Because he's obviously has no legs, and it's like, people that are is he going to drown? Is he going to be okay? And I think that's why Forrest goes and looks over to make sure that he's fine, and you see him swimming like a normal person.
Yeah. There is something weird. Forrest says he never actually said so. Like Lieutenant Dan says, I never thanked you for saving my life. And then he jumps off the boat. Forrest says, he never actually said so.
Yeah.
But I think he made his peace with God.
Yeah.
So.
And then after that, when we see, Lieutenant Dan's a completely different person. He just realizes that I was, telling, Lewis this before, that he thought the whole, his whole life, like, was tied to a purpose of dying on the battlefield. And that's, like, what his expectations were for himself and for his family. And so he didn't think, like, I'm going to have a happy life. I'm going to have a wife or a career or a family or anything like that. Like, he never looked that far ahead for himself because he just didn't. Because he didn't think it wasn't my destiny, it wasn't my plan. Like, I'm not going to even go there. And then after that, we see that, he has, eventually has, like, a fiance, right? I think it's his fiance.
Yeah, well, so they start, the business actually is booming. Like, the shrimping boat business, they have 12 Jennies, and then, and Forrest leaves because, his mother dies, and he goes home, and then he says, I never went back to work for Lieutenant Dan, but he took care of, our money, our business. And then he gets a letter that they've invested in Apple, which we all know is like the #1 company today. So if
because he says we don't have to worry about money anymore.
Yeah. So in a third reality, if Forrest exists, he's a billionaire by now. So
yeah. So it's like he never was living in a sense. Like after he lost his legs, he was just existing. And he found his happiness with, it wasn't so much monetary, but the fact that he was going to get married and that he probably was going to have children and just be like a family man. And even though he was, disabled, he had like those, what did he say they were? Those titanium something.
Oh, yeah, okay. So
he was able eventually to walk again.
Yeah, so I think, so the next time we see him in the movie, it's when Forrest is getting married. And again, when he catches Lieutenant Dan off in the distance, like he gets excited, like he's looking at him, and he notices,
he's in shock.
I mean, he's happy to see him, but he's also in shock because he's walking with a woman who becomes his wife, and it's like we see full circle his redemption, like Lieutenant Dan's redemption, and we can't help but realize that Forrest played a part in it. That Forrest did play a part in his redemption, because if he never made that promise of being a shrimping boat captain, then Lieutenant Dan would have never followed him. Lieutenant Dan would have never faced God in the storm and come out in one piece. So we do see like a full redemption, not only of his character, but also in a way of his body. Like in a sense, he's been resurrected.
Like his physical body.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have his actual legs back again, but he can walk. Like he can have assimilation. Like he's recaptured some of his self that's died.
That he lost. Yeah, some of the stuff that he lost.
So, in a sense, so there is this. We're not going to go too much into it because it's for another video, but there is a sense that Lieutenant Dan represents a certain ideology or a viewpoint of just fate. Like, this is my fate. This is my
like a plan.
Destiny, yeah.
And you're planned for the plan that people have out for themselves. Like, I'm going to plan this and it's going to be. Like, regardless of anything else. Regardless of God. Like, this is the plan that I have for myself, and no matter what, it's gonna happen. Yeah, so we can, I mean, this goes back to, again, antiquity, like Greek times. Like, you think of the story of, Oedipus, there's a prophecy that he'll kill his father and marry his mother, and he can't avoid it because it's fate. Like, no matter, so he ends up, because of this prophecy, I can't remember if he finds out, and he leaves the town. But then, growing up in another city, he becomes like, real strong and a king and or some, person of authority. And on a road one day, he ends up coming across what was actually his father, and they had like a quarrel. He ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. And the point of the story was, you can't avoid your fate. You can't avoid your fate. It's going to happen. And so I think some people, too, today think that, well, this life is planned out for me. This is just meant to happen. Like, God is in control. He's destined this thing for me to happen, for me to go through this. And because of that, I feel angry. Like, I feel upset that he would somehow plan this, or he would let this happen. And we can think of, people who lose loved ones to
car accidents or cancer or anything.
Or how could, like, people always say, like,
How can God allow
how
this?
can God allow this? How can God, like, how is it okay, like, for this to happen? Like, it's not okay. Like, a loving God would not let this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he kind of represents that character, that viewpoint. And I guess what we see is that like he lets God change him. Like there also is a factor of like free will that he has to let go, and we see that when he's like floating in the water.
Yeah, like let go of his anger and his rage for him thinking that my life wasn't what I wanted it to be, and I don't want this life, but yet I still have life, and I have life for a reason. Mm-hmm. And it was for God to, and with Forrest's help, to reveal to him, this is your reason, this is your purpose. Like, there's still some good in you. You still have life in you. You still have the, capability to be happy, even though things didn't go out the way you wanted them to. And I think that's a testament of life in general, because we can plan things out all we want, and we have things that we need or we think that we need, but ultimately God is going to be involved in the things and kind of guide us where we need to be, even though it's not always the way that we think it's going to happen or should happen.
So that's it. I mean, that's the redemption of Lieutenant Dan.
Great character, one of the greatest characters in cinema, probably. Gary Sinise was great. I can't even imagine anybody else playing Lieutenant Dan other than him. It just doesn't seem real.
It's probably the most defining role in his career.
But I think too, I don't think that he ever looked at Forrest with disdain, at least in the beginning. I think maybe he had inklings that there was something special about, him and Bubba, but I don't think Lieutenant Dan ever said anything, at least in the movie, terrible to Forrest, even though he probably was self-aware of, Forrest's inability or common sense or whatever, his disability. So he never really... One thing about Lieutenant Dan is he never really treated Forrest bad.
Yeah.
We never really saw that because, you would think that a soldier who's like the hardcore man is going to...
He's an officer.
And he's going to say something and put Forrest
down.
And belittle people. And he never does that to Forrest ever, which is kind of... I'm not going to say it's miraculous, but...
It's a gift.
He wasn't harsh to Forrest. Maybe he said some things that were mean, not even, even when he was like taking him down, in the hospital, you thought he was going to beat him up,
or do something to him,
or like hurt him, but he lets him go. He just like lets him go. He just couldn't really ever be mad at Forrest in a sense.
So he's probably aware that Forrest, does have, maybe doesn't have common sense or does have some sort of disability. Maybe he recognizes that and treats him a certain way, which means he does have compassion. Like, even though he's this hard soldier, even through all of that, like, he does have compassion. And, that is kind of a scary scene when he takes him down from the bed. What if he stabbed him or something? Or what if because Forrest, in a sense, represented... at that moment in his life, represented like why his fate didn't get to be lived out, like why his purpose was snuffed out of his life.
And then, last thing, at least for me, was, Forrest was mostly like an innocent, and I think, people that are innocent or that don't have malice or don't, have the connection to be mean or to be evil or to hurt people, I feel like their hearts are very close to God. So in a sense, Lieutenant Dan always needed him, and because he guided him, and he was able to guide him because Forrest had such a pure heart. And when we think about people that have pure hearts, we think people that are closer to God. So it's kind of like, he was Lieutenant Dan's angel that was kind of like guiding him to where he was supposed to be. And that was Forrest's purpose in his life. And that's where he was supposed to be to get him to that point of happiness.
We do see like a certain obedience that Forrest... I mean, I guess Forrest does follow, what people say, but maybe more so in this relationship with Lieutenant Dan because he was his commanding officer. There's a scene where he says, "Get in that hole, Forrest," and he goes in the hole with a pistol. Like there could have been anything down there, another Vietnamese soldier or whatever. But he goes down in the hole like head first and like in strict obedience. Mm. So there definitely is a certain innocence there that Lieutenant Dan benefits from, and it's almost like Lieutenant Dan does guide Forrest as well.
Yeah.
So that's it, guys. Thank you for listening. We have many more videos coming on Forest Gump because there's so much going on in the movie.
It's an American classic.
It is. It's definitely an American classic. So again, watch it. There's so much in the movie. Look for this stuff and let it enrich your literary cinema life and
your spiritual
life because some movies do have a lot of movies do have Christian things that you can pick up on or Christian themes. Even if there are just certain things about life, because Christ is in every aspect of life. So things that He's endowed in us, certain themes that He's given our country or our society or that we embody, everything comes from Him. So we thank you for listening and come back soon. Bye.